My name is Mary Lou Vercellotti. I'm assessing the development of linguistic complexity in ESL speech. So a lot of the measurement of syntactic complexity has been with length measures. One reason is that they're really easy to calculate, right? You can get the transcript, there are scripts, it will count the number of words and utterances and all of that. But there are assumptions with length measures. One, the assumption is longer is more complex, and length shows development. And this comes from the L1, right, when Brown started measuring L1 acquisition. So the conclusion has been in L2 research that length is a suitable proxy for complexity, and it's been used many, many times. Oh, what did I do? That's exciting. Let's try again. Okay, but as people cheekily say, the construct of complexity is complex, and maybe length isn't the best way to measure something as complex as complexity. And there's some examples here about some complex constructions. We have two sentences there here, and they have the same length, but many people would argue that the first one is more complex because there's like a small clause in there. She found the novel to be fascinating, rather than she found the new novel, which is a different, a more simple structure. And then there's the idea that L1 development differs from L2 development because with adult language learners, they have fully developed constructs and concepts of how to understand the world. So we've talked a lot about how to understand complexity in the field with Norris and Ortega saying we need to have multiple complementary measures, right? And Ellis told us that both length and type of construction are both relevant to development. And development might actually mean producing more complex, less frequent, and less similar constructions. And Norris and Ortega also said we might need to come up with a measure of developmentally sensitive and interlanguage-based measures that tap complexity as defined as structural variety or sophistication or some sort of acquisitional timing. And also, when we're looking at CAF or language performance, we often just use one measure. So maybe we need to study interrelated overlapping phenomena to really, really understand development. So that brings me to this study. I wanted to ask, do various measures of syntactic complexity capture growth over time in the speech of instructed ESL learners and capture the expected variation from differences in initial proficiency, right? We expect measures to do those things. And what do those various measures do to reveal the variation in longitudinal data, right? We expect learners to vary, especially over time. And the second question is, what do the findings suggest about the development of complexity in ESL speech? Okay. This is with existing data. I did not intervene in any way. The data come from 66 adult learners of English. There were mixed L1s in an intensive English program, and that's very important. My research only speaks to instructed learners. They gave 2-minute topic-based monologues. Altogether, I had 294 speeches. I spent an entire summer transcribing. It was a lot of fun. And so we've all been there, right? Spending summers coding data. Let me tell you a little bit more about the learners. There were multiple observations over time. From each of those 66 participants, I had between 4 to 7 observations. They were about a month apart within a semester. And of course, the observations would be farther apart across semesters. My goal was to follow them throughout their enrollment in the intensive English program. But as you can imagine, some people came and went, and some people started at a higher level, so they weren't in as long. And that's why there's variation in how many observations. And because I wanted to observe them from when they arrived, the initial proficiency did vary. So initial proficiency was entered as an independent variable in my study. The transcripts were coded into clauses, AS units and clauses using Foster-Tonklin and Wigglesworth 2000. An AS unit is just the equivalent of an oral sentence, basically, for those of you who haven't used them. Clauses were then coded by type. You can see this Vercellotti person a lot in this research. And this study coded them by main clause, verb phrase, adverbial clauses, relative clauses. Teachers might call relative clauses adjective clauses, complement taking predicate. I coded those as the I thinks. These clause types, and I differ. This is a theoretical difference between L1 and L2, in my opinion. Adult learners can put I think in front of everything, and that doesn't mean it's a complex, necessarily a very complex structure. It's a hedge, right? It's just like maybe linguistics is fun, or I think linguistics is fun. I know it's not doing the same work as an independent clause. And also non-finite clauses, gerunds and infinitive, plus a complement or an adjunct. So in Foster-Tonklin's and Wigglesworth, a non-finite clause without another element is not considered a clause, but if it's like from the example from the data, to pay the bills would count as a clause. To pay by itself wouldn't, for example. Any questions? As we know our own data so well, sometimes we skip over things that are important. Okay. So here are the measures of complexity that I used in this study to try to compare which ones are useful. Let's go over them at a time. So over on the left, we have the productivity complexity measures, and these are length-based, right? Mean length of AS unit in words, mean length of finite clauses, also in words, and the mean number of finite clauses per AS unit, the classic subordination. And remember, Norris and Ortega said that our measures should be complementary, not redundant. So that's what I'm trying to do with those, and those are commonly recommended. Now over for the structural, these are more exploratory. The first one is a measure of syntactic variety. Remember I had those 6 clause types? So if a learner gave a speech with only one of those, the main independent, that was 1 out of 6, right? 1.167, right? And if they could produce somewhere in the speech at least one of each of the 6 types, that was 100% of the syntactic variety. Fully admit, I kind of just thought, how can I measure that, right? It's complexity at the discourse level, and it's really informed by the idea that more isn't better. We do not want our learners shoving all 6 clause types in every AS unit. Please, no, right? We want them to use them when appropriate. I'm going to skip over the weighted syntactic complexity measure and go down to we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And I also chose frequency of non-finite clauses as a proxy measure, right? Sometimes we would if we could get a measure that kind of represents the concept, and we can just use that would be great. Okay, now let's go for the crazy one that I created. I did a 4-level scale. If an AS unit, an oral sentence, had only a main clause, it was just a basic AS unit, I gave it a rating of 0. It could have been 1, it could have been 2, it doesn't matter, it's just the lowest one. At the next level, it could be an independent clause with a compound verb phrase or an adverbial clause, just some added additional complexity. And the example there is, then maybe we can share or share a food together. Again, I transcribe these, so I know these students. I feel like we're friends. At the next level, we have the non-finite clauses, and then at the level 3, it's an independent clause with either a relative clause, which is a well-known challenging structure, or a complement-taking predicate. And at the most complex level on this scale is a combination of 2 different types of dependent clauses. So the example is, if I don't like this man and I don't want to have a next date, I think they pay the bill first. She was talking about how she wanted to split the bill, not have one person pay and the other person pay the next time. So, okay, this is time for you all to interact with me, give me some feedback. Generally speaking, I know this is exploratory, but generally speaking, would you say that this clause is more complex? I mean, this AS unit is more complex than the one above it, and so on? Just generally. Come on, give me something.
Not sure about 0 and 1. Yeah.
So, okay, so, and the good point, you didn't say this, but what I heard is, I didn't tell you that I focus on clausal complexity, right? I care about, there's a lot of ways to measure complexity, but I focus on clausal complexity. And the 0 only has 1 verb phrase, but the number 1 has 2 verb phrase. In this case, it's a coordinated verb phrase, but it could also have been a regular subordinate clause with an main clause, independent clause. So it's the difference between 1 verb phrase and 2. And again, you know, English loves, we structure everything around the verb, right? Do you have a question?
I don't have a question.
Okay.
My English is not good. I'm Chinese. I see number 1 is difficult for me.
Oh, okay. There is a phrasal verb in there too, so that's interesting. Okay, so we can debate this later. It's certainly exploratory. It was my attempt to say, what would that measure that was suggested of being taking into consideration sophistication, which is very, very nebulous, right? Like, how do we do that? Sophistication, acquisitional timing. Vercellotti and Packer found that this is the basic order that students produce the same population, right? Okay, so back to this study. So of those 294 transcripts, I calculated the complexity for each of the using each of those 6 measures. And I used hierarchical, linear, and nonlinear modeling to try to model the development of each of those measures. So I have 6 different models over time in an intensive English program. The lovely thing about hierarchical linear modeling is that it's sort of like repeated measures ANOVA, but way, way better. It allows the time between observations to differ, and you're allowed to have a different number of observations per participant, which is key for longitudinal research in almost any time because of attrition, right? We lose learners. And so we can model the change over time and also variation in the data. And as I mentioned earlier, initial proficiency was the only independent explanatory variable that I considered, because we would expect that the measure should capture that difference, knowing that they came in with different levels of proficiency. Okay, so let's look at the results. These are just for the length measures. This is my summary. Okay, so what do we see? Well, first, all of these measures, the length of AS unit, the length of finite clause, and subordination, all captured a linear change over time. So yay, the learners improved. Yay, it's an instructed context, right? So they grew. They could produce more longer AS units over time. We also see that each of these 3 measures captured the variance based on initial scores. And there were remaining variation. In the length of AS units, there was still a very unexplained variation in the change rate. So some students increased how long their AS units were, and some really shot up. So there was variation and change over time. For the phrasal complexity, the length of the finite clauses, there were still differences in the initial scores. So upon arriving at the intensive English program, some students created longer finite clauses right in the beginning. Unexplained. Okay, so that was the length measures. Here are the structural measures. Same thing, right? All three of these measures, even the exploratory ones, found the model showed a linear increase over time. And again, all three showed that, guess what? If you put in initial proficiency in the model, it does explain the differences in initial scores. Again, remaining variation. For the syntactic variety measure, remember that was how many of the 6 clause types. Right in the beginning, there were already variation. Some students, as they arrived in the IEP, had more variety in their 2-minute monologues. Some were already adding dependent clauses. And for the weighted structural complexity, there were still variation at the initial and in the change rate across time. Not any difference in the frequency of non-finite clauses. It's not to say, whenever it says there's not remaining variation, that doesn't mean that there was no variation. There was variation, but the model didn't find it to be systematic, that something might explain it. Okay, so here it is, all 6 of them, all shoved in together. And what do you notice? One thing that I find very important is that the subordination by finite clauses per AS unit and the frequency of non-finite clauses both have a similar model pattern, which is really interesting to me because these are complementary measures. The math does not, this isn't a side effect of the math because finite clauses, of course, are finite, and they're increasing the number of those types of clauses and increasing the number of non-finite clauses. They're adding both at the same time as they're going through the instructed program. So some theoretical implications. I would say that the length and the frequency of more difficult constructions develop together, at least in an instructed context. I would also say that I'm not sure about the weighted complexity measure, but the fact that the exploratory measures, the structural measures, were similar to the length-based measures, to me that allows us to at least defend the use of the very practical length measures. Now, which measure might you want to use if you're into a linguistic-focused research? I would say maybe if you're doing a complexity, accuracy, fluency study or a longitudinal study, or if you're interested in instructed context, subordination might be a good measure to use because it's broad, it captures differences, but there's not so much variation that remains unexplained. But if you are looking at individual differences earlier in development, maybe phrasal complexity, those words per clause might be a good idea. Now, if you want to study differences in learning outcomes, general complexity or that weighted complexity measure might be good because that's where we still had variation to be explained. Of course, there's lots of limitations. One population, maybe not applicable in other situations, particularly untutored language learning. And although this was longitudinal, nearly over a year, a whole 3 academic semesters, it was still only between low intermediate and low advanced. So the pattern might be different for very beginning learners or very proficient learners. And again, the structural measures were exploratory. Any questions and comments that you want to share?